welcome Dr. James Alexander.
Thank you. All right, thanks Andrew, and thanks for the invitation to talk here today. I really appreciate that. I'll just give you a brief bit of biographical detail background. I came to Nimbin as a 10-year-old in 1973. My parents weren't hippies. We were from the suburbs of Melbourne. We were on our way to the Gold Coast for a family holiday, and they must have heard about the Aquarius Festival in the news and were curious about it and dropped in. So I came here as a 10-year-old, probably in September, I think. And that experience gave me a bit of a lust for road trips. So as an 18-year-old, I left Melbourne, bought an old Kombi, and set out to travel around Australia. And I lived in Sydney for a couple of months and on the Gold Coast for a while. And on my first day on the Sunshine Coast, I was hit by a drunk driver in a head-on car accident, nearly killed. And I was told that I spent, being in a Kombi, the whole thing collapsed in on my legs. I was pinned in the car wreck for apparently 2.5 hours, passing in and out of consciousness. Snapped every bone in my right leg in half, 2 broken ankles, cracked skull, and basically nearly bled to death before they could cut me out. As you'd expect, that was a pretty horrible experience. And it hit me for a 6 in all ways, physically as well as psychologically. And within a year, I decided I wanted to be a psychologist so that I could help people who'd been similarly traumatised and provide help to them in ways that I wasn't given help. All the medical assistance that I got, the care that I got was fantastic. But this is in 1981, and I think there was very little awareness about psychological damage and injuries. The term PTSD had only been coined 1 year earlier in 1980. So there's very little awareness about it, and despite the kind of experience that I had, there was no psychological care whatsoever. And that was just the times. Basically, nobody was being negligent. It's just that how it was back in the early 80s. So within a year, I decided I want to be a psychologist, and went ahead, did the required study, and became a psychologist. And then in 1993, my wife and I and our 2 young children decided to come and live in Nimbin. So I wound up back here, and we've been here ever since. And I've been providing psychological services in Nimbin and in Lismore for 31 years, working at Nimbin Medical Centre for the last 20 years. Okay, so the whole topic of trauma and PTSD has a strong personal flavour for me, having experienced what I did. And I guess I've kind of dedicated my working life to dealing with that. That's one of the main things I've focused on in my work. I've written 3 books. I might pass these around. They're not available for sale, but they can be bought on Amazon.com. One of them is A Hidden Psychology of Pain. It's looking at the relationship between psychological factors, particularly trauma, and the experience of chronic pain and other chronic health issues. I wrote a book on sleep called Getting the Zs That You Want. Sleep is often a huge problem, particularly for people that have been highly traumatised. And my 3rd book is called The Tendrils of Trauma, which is about trauma, and it's about my personal experience with trauma and what the science around the studies of trauma is now saying and how that can inform us. All right, so to that end, let's get underway. In the mental health services, the way I make sense of it, there's basically 2 approaches and 2 questions that can be asked of people. The first question is, what's wrong with you? And I think my perception is that's the main orientation in mental health services in the Western world. Personally, I perceive that many problems with that kind of question and the set of assumptions behind that there's inherently something wrong with people. It's an orientation. It's a particular mindset. That goes along with psychiatric diagnoses, typically drug treatments for, in brackets, inverted commas, mental illnesses. I have a huge problem with psychiatric diagnoses. I recognise that people have all sorts of problems in living, many psychological problems in living, and they come in a whole lot of different forms. I just don't think the psychiatric diagnosis adds to the understanding. And in fact, I think they damage and harm people in a way that people don't need. Particularly people that have already been damaged by life, don't need any more damaging. They tend to lead to drug treatments. Yeah, look, there's a role for drugs in the world. There always has been, there always will be. The reality is there's no drug that's ever been created that heals trauma. It just doesn't exist, and I don't think it ever will exist. I'll talk a little bit more later on about psychedelic assisted therapy because there's some There's some really good stuff going on there, but that's of course an interaction between the psychedelic substance and the therapy. It's not the psychedelic substance on its own. The second question, the one that I tend to favour, is what have you been through? What have you experienced? This tends to lead to trauma-informed care, whereby we take into major consideration what people have been through. We need to look at the stories of their lives and their experiences. We need to be able to make sense of why people respond in ways they respond to particular situations. And we can usually make sense of that just by looking at what they've experienced. It's not rocket science. It's pretty obvious to most people. Unfortunately, it just hasn't been that obvious to the mental health professions, which I find pretty disturbing. That sort of orientation has led on to an excellent program and publication that's come out of the UK in the last few years called the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework. It's been developed by psychologists in the UK along with people with lived experience. And it's an excellent alternative to psychiatric diagnosing and way of conceiving what's going on for people that are struggling. So one of the reasons why psychiatric labelling continues is because it tends to be convenient for professionals. So every psychiatric label tends to be a shorthand descriptive term that takes place of a couple of paragraphs of explanation. So it tends to work well for professionals so that we don't have to write several paragraphs of we can just use these little terms. But as I said before, my observation is it's really damaging to people. Humans suffer from being mislabelled and labelled with wrong concepts, and I don't think it's okay. The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework really conceptualises problems in living in terms of what people have been through. If you get onto my website at some point and you have a good look through it, you'll see there are links to the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, and it's really well worth having a look at. It's an excellent, viable alternative to the psychiatric way of making sense of what's going on. So obviously the different questions that we ask about this stuff lead to very different approaches to working with psychological problems in living. People may be familiar with the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, and that's basically a publication of all the psychiatric labels. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. With every new publication, there's more and more. I can't remember what it's up to, but it's over 300, maybe more than that. Andrew, do you know? Over 300 labels. And there are even psychiatrists that are complaining that normal life is being pathologised radically. And so with every publication, more aspects of living get called a psychiatric disorder. About the only label within the whole DSM of the more than 300 labels that are in there that I find that has any value and any genuine authenticity is the notion of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. With the caveat that I don't think it's a disorder at all, so I drop the D off the end. I just don't think there's anything to be gained by, when you're talking about people that have suffered adverse life experiences, to call their responses a disorder. I just don't think that adds anything useful or helpful or meaningful to the whole discussion around that. So with that caveat, I do think that PTSD, post-traumatic stress, is obviously it's a very real phenomenon. I just don't think it's a psychiatric disorder, or I don't think there's anything gained by conceptualising it that way. And I actually think that pretty well every other diagnostic label in the DSM is just post-traumatic stress in disguise. And I'll explain why I think that later. So essentially I think the whole DSM is a catalogue of the different presentations of trauma. And the only term that they use for that is post-traumatic stress disorder. So what constitutes post-traumatic stress? Exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury or sexual violence, either directly or witnessing. So there are plenty of first responders that have to go to fatal car accidents and drownings and all sorts of terrible experiences, and that vicarious trauma is very real for them. Resulting in intrusive symptoms such as distressing memories that just keep on reoccurring, keep on reverberating within people, recurrent distressing dreams, flashbacks, intense prolonged psychological distress, physiological reactions, so people getting into that fight or flight kind of state, or a shutdown sort of state, which is also a trauma response. persistent avoidance of anything that reminds somebody of the aversive event. So people that change their lives, change where they live, change how they go about living in order to avoid any possible cues that they can of the traumatic experience. Alterations in cognitions and mood, so dissociative amnesia. The paradox is some people that are highly traumatised have like what we call a snapshot memory of the traumatic experience. They remember the pattern of the carpet on the floor of the bank that they were in when it was held up by somebody with a gun. They'll remember every minute detail without fault, all the irrelevant detail. They'll remember absolutely everything about it. There are other people that are highly traumatised that have what they call dissociative amnesia. They can't remember. They know something terrible happened. They know they've been traumatised, but they've got huge gaps in their memory around terrible experiences. Negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, about the world. Often people, particularly when they've been traumatised at a young age, use little kid logic and they blame themselves for whatever's happened. So they hold themselves responsible for abuse that's come their way, and you could view that as being a cognitive distortion. It's little kid logic that just gets lodged within them and stays stuck within them. Negative emotional state, obviously, a lot of emotional distress, diminished interest in insignificant activities. So things that used to provide pleasure no longer do. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, an inability to experience positive emotions. Alterations in arousal and reactivity, so being hyper vigilant, irritable behaviour, angry outbursts, reckless self-destructive behaviour, exaggerated startle response, so, you know, the car backfires and it gets a huge reaction within them. Problems with concentration, sleep problems. The DSM suggests that all these symptoms need to be present for more than a month. There are other people that suggest it should be more like about 3 months. Some people suggest 6 months before arriving at an evaluation of somebody suffering from post-traumatic stress, but the DSM says it should be more than 1 month. It must lead to very significant disturbances, impairment in social, occupational or other kind of important areas of life, like relationships. And the disturbance should not be attributable to other causes, things like medications or drugs, other substances that can lead to similar kinds of responses in people. Post-traumatic stress is essentially a problem of being unable to forget. And again, like I said, the irony is before, there are some people that their problem with post-traumatic stress is they forget too much, but most other people essentially have a problem that they can't forget. And it's a reality of their mind, body and brain still being stuck in the experience of that trauma and unable to move itself away from that experience. PTSD is just the tip of the trauma spectrum. So for every, I've got some figures up there, for every 1 military personnel suffering from PTSD, there's 10 civilians that are suffering from it. For every one person that's suffering PTSD, and keep in mind that post-traumatic stress, to receive that diagnosis, that's the extreme end of the trauma spectrum. For every one person that's suffering that, there's probably 20 or 30 other people that are also traumatised, but just not to that same extent. So the PTSD, you think of it as being on a spectrum, a trauma spectrum, and you've got what we call the small t traumas down one end, the big T traumas up this end. The big T traumas are the ones that attract the label of PTSD, and the small t traumas tend not to. But that's simply the most extreme end of the spectrum. And for every one person that finds themselves at that extreme end, there's 20, 30, 40 more people at lesser extreme ends of the spectrum, but they're still highly adversely affected. To such an extent that you could say trauma is essentially ubiquitous in our culture. I don't know any culture that it's not in. I don't know enough about other cultures. But in our culture, I think it's very hard to find anybody that hasn't experienced some kind of trauma. And it's more a question of differing in degrees rather than in kind. So some people are carrying a very extreme trauma burden, some people are carrying a less extreme trauma burden. There's a notion of concept creep. So with every good idea, it tends to be extended and extended and extended. And this happens with the notion of trauma as well. I'm really keen on seeing us as a culture recognise the role that trauma plays. And so I've been an advocate for bringing this to people's awareness for many years. But the reality is the term trauma can be used very flippantly as well. So people say that their boss told them to do something they didn't want to do and they were traumatised by that conversation. To me, that sort of trivialises the very real and significant problem that serious trauma plays in people's lives. So there is a problem of concept creep around the notion of trauma, and I don't think that helps. I think the term still needs to be retained for pretty serious emotional reactions to bad circumstances. 15 to 20% of military personnel wind up with PTSD, and the surprising thing, 80 to 85% don't. I find that surprising if you think of the kind of experiences they have. When civilians go through a natural disaster, 30 to 40% wind up with PTSD, 60 to 70% don't. And again, I find that really surprising. But if you keep in mind, PTSD is the extreme end of the trauma spectrum. So for every one person suffering PTSD from the floods or the bushfires, there's probably 20 other people that are also traumatised, but just not to the same extent. Now, that's a really important finding, that so many people don't wind up with PTSD after a traumatic experience. And what that suggests, clearly, is that for most people, most of the time, their level of distress settles down without intervention, without any therapy, without any counselling. And that suggests that within us as a species, humans have an innate capacity to be able to roll with the punches to a certain extent, to be able to psychologically process and digest bad experiences, work out what makes sense for us to hang on to, and let go of what is toxic for us to hang on to. So that appears to be a natural capacity of humanity. In the Australian population, civilian population, there's 11% lifetime risk of PTSD. Again, for every one person suffering PTSD, there's many more that are also somewhere on the trauma spectrum, but they just don't qualify for that particular label. The ACE studies. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Events Studies. And these are really important studies that started in America, I think in California, in the 1980s, and has since been replicated pretty well all over the world, including Australia and New Zealand. And they basically interviewed 17,000 people. They got a cross-section of American society in terms of racial factors, age, socioeconomic status, etc. And they interviewed them for 10 adverse childhood experiences, including sexual, physical and emotional abuse, substance-reliant parents, death of a caregiver, parental separation, divorce, domestic violence in the home, imprisonment or mental health disturbance of a family member, not enough food, not enough clean clothes, neglect, etc. And so they interviewed these 17,000 people and gave them a score out of 10 in terms of how many ACEs or adverse childhood events they experienced. And followed them up years later, and growing up with 0 ACEs resulted in an 18% lifetime chance of adult depression. Having 1 ACE, 1 adverse child event, boosted that risk by 50%. Having 2 boosted it by 84%. Having 5 or more boosted that risk by 340%, which, if you think about it, is phenomenal. I find it kind of not surprising, but it's still stark just to see that sort of statistic there. Having 7 or more ACEs resulted in increased risks of suicide attempts by 36 times, and having 5 or more boosted the risk of being diagnosed as schizophrenic, again for me in inverted commas because I don't believe in the concept, by 53 to 160 times. So clearly what this shows is that suffering adverse events in your childhood has massive ramifications throughout the lifespan. And in fact, I'll go back to Vietnam veterans again. Some very interesting research was done. Keep in mind, the term PTSD wasn't created until 1980. Vietnam vets had been coming back from Vietnam for quite a bit of time by then, and was the first generation of returned service personnel that they decided to study what's gone on for these people. And they found that certain soldiers, in a company wound up with PTSD. Same soldiers in the same company in the same battles didn't wind up with PTSD. What's going on? Why not? Had they had different experiences? No, they found they had fairly similar experiences in Vietnam. When they started digging a bit deeper, what they found was that the soldiers that wound up with PTSD got to Vietnam with a lot in their distress cup already through things like adverse childhood experiences. So their distress cup was already somewhat full as primarily young men by the time they got to Vietnam. They had bad experiences in Vietnam and it pushed them beyond their ability to cope. So they were simply overwhelmed by the enormity of the bad experiences that they were carrying. Those are the ones that wound up with PTSD. So it wasn't so much dependent on the bad experiences themselves, but the vulnerability that they took with them going to Vietnam. That research finding has since been replicated with soldiers coming back from Afghanistan in the last 10 years. Approximately 42% had an ACE score of 0, and you can see the percentages there going up, the amount of ACEs, and the more and more and more that people had, the ACEs that they had, there was less proportion of the population. So more ACEs is related to risk of substance abuse, heart disease, stroke, cardio-obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, and the whole list goes on for physical health conditions. We'll talk about the psychological issues that come with that in a moment. Recent Australian research came out about a month ago revealed that around 50% of all mental health presentations were related to childhood abuse and neglect. Personally, I think that 50% is a radical underestimate when you take into account the ACE studies. And I know that the people that did that kind of research probably put a lot of validity in the DSM kind of labels. And they've got that particular mindset with them, which to me is not a terribly trauma-informed mindset. If I was doing that research, my guess is I would have found a lot more than 50%. I would think it's probably close to 100%. Okay, ACE scores and rates of depression, antidepressant prescriptions. You can see these are the percentages running up here, and these are the amount of ACE scores, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see the more damaging experiences that people have in their childhood, the greater risk they are of winding up on an antidepressant. Again, you'll see the same trend. This is the underlying chronic depression. Slightly different for men and women. Women are in the red, men are in the yellow. But again, you see the same trend. And to me, what this means is that the whole medical notion of depression as being a thing that you can get, to me, is a fallacy. People are depressed, there's no question about that. There's the experience of, persistent flat mood and loss of enjoyment of life, etc. But I make sense of it in terms of the ACEs. I don't think it's a medical condition. I think it's an emotional, psychological response to adverse life events in the childhood, developing that burden of trauma in your childhood, then combined with adverse experiences, stressful life experiences in your life now. I think that's what results in depression. And in saying that, I query and question the whole notion of depression as being an illness that you either have or you don't have. I just think it's an emotional reaction to this combination of our history and the current life stresses that are going on. Again, same trend with ACEs and adult alcoholism. Same trend with ACEs and drug abuse. So these are people that have ever had a drug problem, ever been addicted to drugs, ever injected drugs. So again, you see, with everything that you care to measure, anything they care to ask questions about, all these indicators of emotional well-being or physical health, the same trend keeps on being shown. IV drug use and ACEs. Smoking cigarettes and ACEs. So again, the trend is just, it's undeniable. Since the initial ACE studies were done with that sample of 17,000 people, they've done replication studies in Canada, Germany, Britain, other parts of America, Australia and New Zealand. They're the ones that I know of. And they keep on saying exactly the same thing. There's no new findings in it. It's just the same story that keeps on coming up. So clearly what goes on in people's childhood is hugely important in setting people up for an ability to cope with life, the burden that they're carrying, the resources that It's required, the psychological resources are required to just sort of quell the distress from carrying that burden, makes less resources available to be adaptive to what's going on in your life now and to be able to respond adaptively to stresses, etc. Teen sex behaviours, sexual behaviours. So intercourse by 15. Again, it's the same trend, same pattern. Teen pregnancy, teen paternity. So for both young males and young females, the same thing. Suicide attempts. Same pattern. Okay, so if anybody's come across, I'm sure lots of people here have heard of Gabor Mate, a Hungarian-Canadian physician. He wrote an excellent book called Scattered Minds about ADHD. And in that book he's essentially drawing a very clear and strong connection between developmental or attachment trauma and later ADHD type behaviours and experience. To such an extent, I think, again, I view all the most of the labels in the DSM as being trauma in disguise, and I think ADHD is as well. The functional MRI scan studies that are done on kids that wind up with a label of ADHD or kids that wind up with a label of autism are almost identical to the brain scans of children that are highly traumatised through adverse child events. So I think we're talking about the same stuff. There's different presentations and there's different ways of making sense of those presentations. One of the realities in the Western world is that the poorer people are, the more socially disadvantaged they are, the more likely they are to wind up receiving psychiatric diagnoses, treated in mental health hospitals, often against their will, drugged, often against their will, ECT applied to them, often against their will. So we don't live in a society where it's an even playing field, we all know that, but that has a massive ramification for how we as a society make sense of people struggling in life. And the reality is the poorer people are, the less educated they are, the less articulate they are, the more disadvantaged they are, the more likely they are to be viewed as being mentally ill and forcibly treated against their will with a complete disregard for their civil liberties and their well-being. I've worked with many people over the years that have been highly traumatised by their psychiatric treatment. I know there are people that report they had good experiences in this. It's not a complete statement about it, but there are many people that have been highly traumatised by their psychiatric treatment. And the reality is that people that are more educated, have better incomes, are more articulate, are in a better position, a more advantageous position in society, have more freedom to not receive those labels, and we have the freedom to resist the psychiatric labelling and treatment of people. So if you look at the kind of, there's that reality, but there's also the pressures of poverty, the unrelenting stress that goes along with poverty for people, the unrelenting stress that goes along with racism for people, homophobia, misogyny, all the different kinds of rotten things in our world all have a negative impact on people's emotional well-being. And if you grow up with that stuff, you grow up being impacted by that stuff, then you carry a burden of that. And that's part of what adds into the ACE studies. As I said before, it appears really obviously, in fact, by looking at what the studies say, that as a species we have an innate capacity to be able to process and digest bad experiences. If that wasn't the case, you wouldn't get 60 to 70% of civilians that have gone through a natural disaster not suffering from PTSD, clearly. You wouldn't get 80 to 85% of military personnel not suffering from PTSD after war experience, clearly. So as a species, we have this innate capacity to be able to psychologically process and digest bad experiences. It's an analogy. I ran this analogy by a nutritionist once, but the analogy is that just like we take in food, we chew it up, goes to our stomach extracts the nutrients, expels the waste, our mind or brain has a similar capacity with adverse life experiences. And I ran that by a nutritionist once. She said, no, that's not how it happens. She didn't explain how it does happen. I thought that's what happened with food, but apparently not. Well, I got something wrong with that. But anyway, think of that as being a rough and slightly incorrect analogy or metaphor, that our mind-brain has an ability to get hold of experiences, chew it up, get a sense of what it is that we need to hang on to, what serves us to hang on to, separates that from what no longer serves us to hang on to, what's toxic for us to hang on to, what simply doesn't serve our interests, and in a sense spit out what we don't need and file away into our long-term memory system what we do need. And that process is called memory consolidation. It appears, weirdly enough, to be most active when we're asleep and primarily when we're dreaming. And it appears very much from decades of research in sleep laboratories that dreams are essentially a vehicle that allows our mind-brain to symbolically get hold of our experiences, mostly symbolically, create essentially a play or a drama around those experiences, allow the very real feelings that are attached to those experiences to come up in the context of the dream, with the purpose being hopefully to arrive at a place in the dream where there's some kind of resolution to that problem. So an example I often give is if a kid's being bullied at school and being chased through the playground every day by other kids, he might go home and have a dream about being chased through a forest by a pack of wolves that are trying to catch him and tear him apart. And so that's a symbolic representation of what's going on for him on a daily basis at school. The purpose of that is not to torment him in his sleeping life. The purpose is that if he can stay with the dream and not wake up in fright, which will often happen, that the dream can wind up at some point of resolution. So, for example, he might come across a cottage and he gets into the cottage and he can lock the door and the wolves get locked out. Or there's a protective person in the cottage that pulls out a double-barrel shotgun and shoots the wolves or something like that. In whatever way, the drama can arrive at some kind of better outcome. And the purpose of that is to alleviate the emotional burden that kid's feeling from being bullied at school. So a lot of research suggests that that's not the only function of dreams, but it seems to be one of the really important functions of dreams. To allow us to work through the experience, again, spit out what we don't need and file away into our long-term memory system what we do need. And that process is called memory consolidation. Now that ability, that capacity can be overwhelmed by the enormity of a bad experience. What can often happen is that we're carrying this burden. Let's say if there's a soldier that's come back from a war, he or she's carrying an emotional burden from what they've experienced. Their armoured personnel carrier blew up and all their friends got killed and they lost a leg and an eye or something like that. And they're having recurrent nightmares about that. The recurrent nightmares are not trying to torment or torture them. It's their mind recognising there's an emotional wound here that's needing healing, and it will keep on bringing them back to that. Now, it may symbolically represent that experience, or sometimes people have very literal dreams that kind of present what actually happened. And that soldier, ex-soldier, may have this dream repeatedly, but when the terrible thing happens, they can get a surge of adrenaline in the dream and wake up in fright. And what that means is that the processing that the dream is meant to be stops at that point. And their mind, brain recognises there's still this emotional wound here that needs healing. It's going to bring them back to it again, and maybe they wake up in fright again from a surge of adrenaline. The processing stops again, and every night their mind keeps on bringing them. That's a reoccurring nightmare. It is a form of torment and torture, of course, but that's not the intended purpose. Is to be healing. And if that person, that soldier, could somehow sleep through that moment and not wake up in fright, there's a good chance that their mind might bring about some kind of different outcome to the story. And if that happened, the soldier may wake up, may have no recollection of the dream whatsoever, but may just simply feel emotionally better. And that seems to be one of the main purposes of dreaming. There are other purposes of dreaming. Some dreams are anticipatory, so we're expecting something to come up, and it could be preparing us for, a particular stressful situation that we've got to deal with. But many of these really important dreams seem to be dreams in which our mind, brain is processing, digesting bad experiences. Now as I gave that example, that capacity can be overwhelmed. but particularly overwhelmed when the traumas that somebody's mind, brain needs to process are adverse child event traumas. Because when they're little kids, they've got a very little ability to cope. You look at little kids, they haven't been on the planet for long. It takes years to develop coping resources and strategies and ways of coping. And little kids just haven't been around for long enough to develop those strategies. That means little kids with little coping abilities have a little ability to cope with adversity. And we all know that. That's why we all want to be protective towards children and look after them. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen for all kids, clearly. So when a child is going through adverse life experience, some kind of abuse experiences or trauma, that innate capacity to cope has been overwhelmed and swamped. A large part of that experience gets put in a too hard basket and it gets just put over there somewhere. Everything else can be processed, probably on a nightly basis when they're dreaming, what happens at school, the things that they're learning, etc., what's happening at home. But that stuff around the trauma gets put in a too hard basket, the lid gets put on it, and it gets put over there somewhere. And most of us go through our lives with stuff in the too hard basket over there somewhere, sitting there in a fairly raw state. And by raw, I mean unprocessed. So the processing is the capacity to work out what do we need to hang on to, what serves us, separate that from what no longer serves us, spit out what we don't need, and file away into our long-term memory system what we do need. That ability can be overwhelmed, particularly when people have been traumatised as children. And again, what that shows is with the Vietnam veterans' research around PTSD, those that wound up with PTSD got to Vietnam with a lot in their distress cup, and that's all unprocessed trauma that then gets added to by their experiences in Vietnam, and then they're at that overpoint. They simply can't process anymore. The other soldiers didn't like what they experienced. The battle might have been the worst day of their life, etc. Horrible experience. But for the other soldiers, it begins to settle down with time as the normal processing occurs. And that's why most people left untreated will recover from trauma. 60 to 70% of the civilian population after natural disasters will recover from trauma without any treatment. Because over time, that level of distress naturally, probably through the process of dreaming and the memory consolidation process, begins to naturally settle down with time. But the most traumatised people, the people at the extreme end of the trauma continuum, they've already been overwhelmed. That natural ability's already been overwhelmed. So that natural memory consolidation doesn't happen. By the way, neuroscientists say that memory consolidation can take up to 30 years. So we're not just dreaming about what happened yesterday, we're doing that, but we're also dreaming about stuff that happened up to 30 years ago. It still needs to find, stuff that still needs to find a proper place within us, or stuff that still needs to be spat out, essentially. The accumulated burden of unprocessed trauma is what results in psychological symptoms, which is what I think the DSM is all about. As I said, I think pretty well every label in there is trauma in disguise. What to do about it? Okay, so for most people, we don't need to do anything about it other than provide support and care in their normal lives. If people are living in danger, they may need legal help or police help in order to get out of danger. That's a really important thing. It's very hard for people to process trauma if they're still in the trenches. So if they're still living with, extreme threat in their life, that needs to be addressed first, obviously. And then for most people, once that safety's been created, most people will be able to naturally reduce their level of distress around the bad experiences. It'll occur spontaneously over a period of time. When that doesn't happen, and I'll add here, by the way, what not to do about it, pretty well all psychoactive substances, particularly ones that have a sedating effect on the brain, which include all the benzodiazepines like Valium, all the three major types of antidepressants, alcohol, cannabis, any drug that has a sedating effect on the brain actually inhibits REM sleep. So if REM sleep is our ability to be able to process our way through bad experiences, any substance that inhibits our ability to REM sleep is kind of not helpful. It might be helpful in other ways, people tend to self-medicate or get prescription medications in order to quell their distress, and sometimes that's really necessary and makes sense for that person. But ultimately, in terms of processing your way through a traumatic experience, if people reach for substances in response to, let's say they have a bad car accident, and they turn to alcohol as a way of coping with the distress around that, if they're regularly consuming alcohol as a way of coping, they're probably interfering with that natural digestive capacity. Because every night they're going to be getting less REM sleep. And people that have been traumatised need more REM sleep, not less REM sleep, in order to process their way through it.
I'm just curious, would
Yep.
cannabinoids get in that way?
Sorry?
I'm curious, would the cannabinoids get in that
No,
way?
because they're not a psychoactive substance. THC is, but cannabinoids aren't. So cannabinoids won't do that. Yeah. All right, so creating current time safety is a really major priority. And we know that with the floods, with the bushfires, people need to be out of danger. You can't be dealing with trauma while you're still in it. People need to have safety created for them. There's a whole range of different kinds of... the Western world and the Eastern world has a whole range of ways of trying to help people that have been traumatised, and probably always have had ways. So these include things like yoga, tai chi, meditation, music, sport, dance, singing, drumming, rock climbing, surfing, trauma release exercises, etc. Essentially anything that brings you back to the present moment, that compels you to be in the present moment. Because usually what's going on in the traumatised mind, brain, body is the person's not here now. They're back there 20 years ago when this horrible thing was happening, or back in their childhood experience, or 2 weeks ago when they're in the bushfire or whatever. They're trying to be here now, but their brain is still in survival mode because they've been stuck in that place. And essentially they're trying to go through the motions of being here now, but they're emotionally and psychologically back in that trauma time. So things like drumming, dancing, tai chi, yoga, etc. compel people to be in the present moment. And that's a way of kind of retraining the nervous system to come back to move away from a trauma response and come back to hopefully a place and time of safety rather than being constantly stuck in a time of unsafety. Have people heard of TRE, trauma release exercise? I think I have done it once. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it's based on the idea that we're more likely to be traumatised in the context of a bad thing happening when we feel unable to respond. We might be unable to respond because I was unable to respond to my car accident because I was trapped in the car wreck, I couldn't move. People might be restrained by others and therefore unable to respond. Escape might not be possible. So there's a multitude of ways that people can't respond in a traumatic circumstance. And people are more likely to wind up with extreme trauma as a result of being unable to respond. If you can respond, if you can run away, then you've got a better chance of being lower down on that trauma spectrum compared to if you can't run away. So if you're in a bushfire and there's simply nowhere to run to, then that's going to be the worst circumstance, obviously, right? And we've got the fight or flight response is essentially a mobilising of our body's energy resources to take action so that we can run away or we can defend ourselves. The body gets mobilised, so adrenaline gets the heart pumping really fast, blood pumps out to our arms and legs, and our body and the energy resources are mobilised for vigorous action to get ourselves out of danger or to protect ourselves. When that's been blocked, it's like the energy resources have been made available, but we can't do anything with it. And the body gets stuck in that moment. So trauma release exercises are getting people to hold kind of unnatural positions. So one of them is leaning up against a wall and trying to be at a 90-degree angle like that and just hold that position for as long as you can. And eventually your legs are going to start shaking. Eventually the muscles are going to start giving way. Or laying on your back with your legs sort of open in that way and holding them. And again, very unnatural kind of position. But eventually your legs are going to start vibrating and shaking. And the idea is that the shaking is a utilisation of that energy that was created in the traumatic experience now gets the chance to have some kind of release. So I think that can be a really good thing. Drugs, either self-medicating or prescription, it's usually aimed at sedation, so they tend to be a palliative option in that they quell the associated distress. I think for anybody to criticise that, I think, is unduly moralistic. I've got no right to criticise anybody choosing to put whatever they want into their system if that's what they feel helps them. And I think people should have that right. And it may help the person to feel less stress, less pain in the moment, but it doesn't result in the psychological processing of trauma. And in fact, it may inhibit it through inhibiting REM sleep. But again, I've got no right to have an opinion on what somebody chooses to do to quell their own distress. Trauma-specific psychotherapies, there's a bunch of those. I'm most familiar with EMDR, eye movement desensitisation reprocessing, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. They all tend to be highly experiential and emotional rather than primarily cognitive. So people have probably heard of cognitive behaviour therapy. It's the most, CBT, it's the most done form of psychology in the Western world. I think it's been done to death. And it's a very cognitive approach, as the name suggests, in that it's all about thinking. So it's getting people to review their thinking styles, to critique their own thinking styles, to change their thinking styles to be more adaptive. And it's a very prefrontal activity, so prefrontal brain activity. It's about your intellect, essentially. Trauma is not about the intellect. It's not about cognition. It has almost nothing to do with that. Almost. Not entirely, but almost nothing to do with cognition. Trauma is about your emotional brain, which is much deeper in the brain structure than your thinking brain. So trauma-specific psychotherapies tend to be highly experiential and emotional. They tend to get, by and large, they'll get people to re-experience their traumatic, what happened, which can be horrible for people. And not everybody's willing to do that. And that's, again, as a trauma therapist, I've got to respect the fact that this is not for everybody. It is for many people, but there's clearly some people that it's just too hard for them to go there, and again, that needs to be respected. The difference is that we're re-evoking the distress via the traumatic memories, this time in the context in which the therapist is providing containment, reassurance and safety. Now, am I able to provide that to everybody? No, I'm not. I can't be that to everybody. For many of my clients I can, because fortunately they view me in a certain way. But I've had clients that have said to me, yes, I'd like to do this, but I don't want to do it with you. I don't know why. I don't tend to ask them why. But I have to respect that. Whatever it is about me, and it could be I might look like a teacher they had at school that was nasty to them, or their nasty father or uncle or whatever. For whatever reason, I'm not going to be that person for that particular client. I'm not going to be able to provide that containment, the safety, the reassurance. Fortunately, most of my clients can view me as a person that can create that. And there's a very big attempt within EMDR to create that safety and containment. Freud's psychotherapeutic insight, the big irony is, if we want to overcome the past, we've got to revisit it. Otherwise, the past is going to stay there being fairly intact, and it's going to keep on pulling our emotional strings. So it's a paradox. If you want to get over the past, you've got to revisit it. Again, not everybody's equally up for that, and that needs to be respected. So eye movement desensitisation reprocessing, EMDR, is what I do with people. Like I said, there are many other types of psychotherapy. I just don't know much about them. I know this is what I know the most about. But no doubt there are very other effective approaches. EMDR bolsters and supports the natural capacity to be able to process and digest traumatic experiences. It does this by replicating a brain behaviour, which is, as we know, the brain is an electrochemical system, and the brain is basically buzzing with different voltages of electricity. When we're dreaming, the brain is running at 40 megahertz of electricity. And when we're doing EMDR, the brain also runs at 40 megahertz of electricity. So it appears that what we're doing with EMDR is we're replicating a particular brain behaviour, and we do that through the eye movements. People are probably aware that dreaming sleep is often called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. So we know that somebody's dreaming when we see their eyes moving like that. It looks like they're watching a ping pong match. They could be sitting in their dream, sitting on a beach looking at the sunset like that. But if we see them having that dream, it looks like they're watching a ping pong match. So it's independent of what they're dreaming. All mammals do it. If you've got a cat or a dog, you'll know when it's dreaming. Watch their eyes. Children will see it clearly. In EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, we're using that observation that the time when our brains are most active at processing, digesting experiences is when we're dreaming. When we're dreaming, the eyes are going like that. In EMDR, we replicate that. In a sense, we're manually kickstarting the mind-brain's capacity to do that processing. So we target specific memories, and this is part of the case conceptualization, making sense of why people are presenting in the way that they are with the problems that they've got in terms of what they've been through, what their experiences are, what are the traumatic experiences. We identify the different traumatic experiences that we've got to work with. We help them to get back in touch with memories around, we work with one at a time. We can't work with that whole bird in one go. We target specific memories one at a time. We tune them into that memory network through a series of questions that we're asking, so it reactivates that memory network around that bad experience. Once that's been reactivated, we kickstart the mind-brain's ability to do that processing manually and get them to follow my hand with their eyes. And so their eyes are going like that, just as they are when they're dreaming. We do that in sets of 30 seconds or so. And weirdly enough, and I acknowledge it's completely weird, it tends to work. It tends to work really well. I first heard about EMDR in my first 1 or 2 years as a psychologist in the late 1980s, and I thought, what a load of rubbish, this will disappear really quickly. I ignored it for 15 years. 15 years later, I looked into it and I discovered it's got more research evidence than anything else that psychology has ever come up with in the previous 120 years. Hands down, it's just got more research evidence supporting it, even though it seems really weird. I've got 2 video explanations on my website about the nature of trauma and EMDR, so it could be worth having a look at that. I provided that because I think this is so weird it requires a really adequate explanation. Most people are pretty smart. Most people deserve an adequate explanation for doing something as weird as that. So that's why I provided those videos. In a sense, dreams are stripping for import our experiences. So the average 50-year-old has nearly 300,000 hours of being awake. I'm over 50, so I don't know, I'd have 350,000 hours of being awake, something like that. But if I added up all my memories together, I'd be lucky to reach maybe 100. What's happened to all those other hundreds of thousands of hours of memories? Well, I experienced them, but my mind brain has stripped them for import into my long-term memory system. So it's taken out of the short-term memory system. It's got rid of all the irrelevant data, all the things I don't need to hang on to. It's pulled out the gist of the experience and filed that away into the long-term memory system. That's what doesn't happen for highly traumatised people. The stuff stays in the short-term memory system. So the oldest person I've done EMDR with was a woman that was about 83 or 84 who was sexually abused when she was about 3 years old. 80 years later, this was still within her like it happened 2 days ago. It was still in her short-term memory system. It hadn't been stripped for export. The toxic elements of it hadn't been spat away. And fortunately, she was responsive to EMDR and had a good outcome. So, like I said, we manually kickstart that innate capacity of the mind-brain. And essentially what it does, BLS stands for bilateral stimulation, which is what that is. That's what we call it. That seems to allow the person's mind-brain to have one foot in the present because they're attending to that, and one foot in the past because we've tuned them into the memory network. And that seems to help people to not just loop around and around and around the distressing memory network, which is what usually happens. It's almost like we put a circuit breaker into that loop through the bilateral stimulation because that requires that they attend to what's happening now as well. They've got one foot in the present, one foot in the past, neurologically speaking. That when it works, and it tends to work a lot of the time, if not most of the time, it allows people's mind-brain to kind of update itself to its current reality, which could be, I'm now 83 years old, I'm not being sexually abused, or it's over now, I survived it, etc. we systematically work our way through a whole list of adverse life experiences of people. Studies comparing EMDR with CBT, SSRI, antidepressants and placebo drugs. 6 hours of therapy done over 6 weeks, so 6 hours of the drug treatment or placebo drug, or 6 hours of CBT, 6 hours of EMDR. And people are measured on a scale of trauma, like from 0 to 10. And after 6 weeks, they'd all reduced their levels of their score of trauma. EMDR had doubled the reduction compared to the CBT, SSRIs, antidepressants and the placebo drug. They measured them again 6 months later. The CBT, antidepressants and placebo drugs, their measures had all gone back up again to where they were before. The EMDR group continued to go down. Measured them 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later. The trend is they continue to go down even though there's been no more treatment. So it appears that when we've reactivated that natural capacity to process and digest, it does what it does. It keeps on doing what it does. Psychedelic assisted therapies. Clearly, I think that's going to be a major healing force for the future. We all know that they were made legal, I think it was just last year. The reality is that I don't know anybody that can afford to do it. The current model that they've got around it is it requires 2 therapists. Therapists need to be paid. They're going to get paid a handsome hourly rate, ×2. There needs to be a 1 to 2 hour introductory session, a 7-hour therapy session with 2 therapists, a 1 to 2 hour session with 2 therapists as a you know...
Debrief.
Sorry?
Debrief?
Yeah, debrief. And of course, all that costs a phenomenal amount of money. So you're talking somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000, depending on how much the therapists are going to charge, and they don't tend to charge lightly. I don't know anybody that can afford that. So they've made it legal, but it's simply not financially available. I think that what will eventually happen is I think the federal government will be eventually convinced, probably through economic arguments, to fund military personnel to receive psychedelic assisted therapy. They'll get good results from that. They'll see the economic benefits of getting people off lifetime psychiatric drugs and hospitalisation. They'll see the economic benefits of that. Then I think state governments will eventually say, oh, maybe our police officers and first responders, we've got a responsibility for them. We can help them. And then I think eventually it's going to be everybody else. But I think don't hold your breath. It's going to be quite a while. It works. The evidence is clearly there. And the evidence has been there for a long time. It's been accumulating for the last 50 years that psychedelic assisted therapy works. Like any intervention, it's not going to work for everybody. Like any intervention, there will be some people that have an adverse effect to it. But for most people, most of the time, psychedelic assisted therapy, the research evidence shows that it works. Again, that's the model that they present. And I ask the question, who can afford this? Can we heal trauma? Do we ever really heal it? My answer to that is we can aim to cease to be crushed by trauma. My lifetime experience has been that with my own trauma, that's the trauma, and I tend to orbit around it, and at different times in my life I engage with it, and I do whatever therapy is available at the time, and then I go back and live my life and I orbit around it. Another time in life I re-engage it with another particular therapeutic approach, and I bring with me the benefits from the last exercise, and then I go back at it in my life, and another time in life I re-engage with it again. And with every kind of re-engagement, my experience has been the impact of it lessens to a point where I believe that people can cease being crushed by trauma. It will wind up having a legitimate place in somebody's life. You know, it will always be part of their life story and an important part. But there's a big difference between that and being crushed by trauma. And I see people repeatedly who cease being crushed by trauma. So to me that looks like healing. I believe that's very possible with persistence. Okay, I think that's pretty well all we've got time for today. Thank you. I'll hang around at lunchtime if people want to ask questions or whatever.
Thank you very much. Another excellent presentation. James will be hanging around over the road there, so don't proceed with the questions here because I'm going to set up the next person, which is me. So we'll both be around at lunchtime, so feel free to gather information. James is good. I see James from time to time to help with my stuff. And as I know, there'll be people in this room who've also done that. So for me, the work he does has been really helpful. So from a personal level as well as